Good afternoon. We acknowledge and pay tribute to the original inhabitants of this land. The city of New Orleans is a continuation of an indigenous trade hub on the Mississippi River, known for thousands of years as Bulbancha. Native peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial, and the resilient voices of Native Americans remain an inseparable part of our local culture. With gratitude and honor, we acknowledge the indigenous nations that have lived and continue to thrive here.
Hey everybody, welcome to our Yates Lecture, which Hilary will tell you was suspended and was originally planned in the before times, this being the after times. So let me take this opportunity before she speaks to shamelessly plug the Murphy Institute and some other events we have. So if you like this talk, and I think you will like this talk, we also have that the Murphy Institute sponsors talks in the philosophy department, sponsors a seminar series in economics, sponsors a health economics seminar series, sponsors a seminar series in political science, and did I say philosophy already? No, all right, well, philosophy also. So please spread the word and try to attend any and all of the Murphy-sponsored talks that you might find going on around campus. How do you find out more about Murphy events? Use the QR codes that you'll find on those flyers. There's a few flyers in the back of the room, and if you use your QR code on your phone, you'll be able to get more information about other Murphy events going on. So with that, what can one say about Hilary? Actually a lot. So let me tell you what we can say. So Hilary is the professor of public policy and economics and holds the Haas Distinguished Chair in Economic Disparities at the University of California, Berkeley, where she also co-directs the Berkeley Opportunity Lab. Her research focuses on poverty, inequality, food and nutrition programs, and the impacts of government tax and transfer programs on low-income families. She is a member of the American Academy of Art and Sciences, the National Academy of Social Insurance, and is a fellow of the Society of Labor Economists. She has served as co-editor of the American Economic Review and the American Economic Journal, Economic Policy, and is on the editorial board of the American Economic Review Insights. But it doesn't stop there. She has served on the National Academy of Sciences Committee on building an agenda to reduce the number of children in poverty by half in 10 years, the American Economics Association's Executive Committee, the Federal Commission on Evidence-Based Policy Making, the Advisory Committee for the National Science Foundation, and the National Advisory Committee for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Scholars and Health Policy Research Program. In 2014, she received the Caroline Shaw Bell Award from the Committee on the Status of Women in the Economics Profession of the American Economic Association. So please join me in welcoming Hilary Hoynes to our Yates Lecture.
Thanks everybody for being here. Thanks for coming out. So I dug back in my calendar a few years and remembered that it was March 12th, 2020 that I was supposed to be here. And I remember sending an email to Kathleen saying, I'm not sure that this is a good idea. And she said, I think everything's still kind of going here, which it was at Berkeley as well, but if you're not comfortable, it's okay. And I remember thinking, I think I'm not going to go. And then 2 days later, everything changed. So I really am just delighted to be here. I'm so happy to see so many people out. I think we're all still kind of getting used to coming back, who've told me that this is the first sort of public lecture you guys have had, and the same thing is going on at my own university. So it's great to have you all here today. So I want to talk to you about child poverty in the United States. And part of this story is going to be an optimistic story. I'm an optimistic person. I'm from the upper Midwest. We think positively. There's going to be some sad parts of this story, and I think some positive parts of the story. But let me just start out with sort of laying the setting. And so the data that I'm showing you here in this scatter plot is just data from the OECD. And on the horizontal axis is a measure of how much a country spends on benefits for families with children as a share of GDP, to account for size of the economy and so on. And on the vertical axis is a poverty rate of children measured in a consistent way across countries. And what you can see in this figure is that the United States sort of lives in the upper left quadrant of this graph, where we have low spending on children and families and high rates of child poverty. And there's kind of the bookend of this talk is sort of the not very rocket science comment that the most important way to reduce child poverty is to give families money. And so I want to kind of build a story to get to that point. Interestingly, if you look at the elderly in the United States, we're not an outlier. So if you do sort of the same exercise, although all I'm showing you here is our spending, what you see is we're sort of an average spender with respect to the elderly in the United States compared to the OECD countries. And so again, this is just the OECD data. It's as a share of GDP, how much spending is on, this is measuring pensions because it's something that's measured across all countries. And you see that we look about average in the OECD, a little bit below average. And so one of the things I want you to think about from the beginning in this conversation is, why do we spend less on children in the United States? And I would tell you that if I were to show you this graph over time, over the decades, you would see that we haven't moved very much, that we've very consistently been a country with relatively high rates of child poverty and relatively low rates of spending on families with children. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about lately, and I have a recent paper with Anna Iser and Adriana Yarasmuni that came out last spring in the Journal of Economic Perspectives. And one of the things that we kind of thought about in that paper, or just observed, is that economists and policymakers, and I'm not really sure where the causal direction goes, whether it goes from economists to policymakers or policymakers to economists, I'm not sure. But the observation is, when we talk about policies for families with children, we spend most of our time talking about how and if the policy will affect decisions that parents make. Importantly and centrally, how it affects how much they work, and then also how it affects marriage decisions and fertility decisions. And that laser focus on how policies affect decisions of parents sort of misses the point that these policies are aimed at children. And so one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is, how does that affect where our policies end up? Essentially focusing on the costs of programs without thinking about the benefits of programs. And so that's kind of a theme in my talk today. So to quantify this, Anna and Adriana and I went to more than 50 years of data on academic journal publications in economics, all the way back to 1970. And we took all papers published in the top 5 economic general interest journals, as well as a handful of the sort of most important journals in labor and public economics, such as the Journal of Public Economics, the Journal of Labor Economics, and others. And we took each paper that was published on the social safety net for families with children and categorized whether or not that paper studied benefits of the program, like how does this program affect child performance in school? Or how does it affect incentives? So how does it affect labor supply? How does it affect marriage and fertility? And what you can see is something that, I didn't know the quantification of it, but it was certainly consistent with my read and observation as someone who'd worked in this literature for more than 25 years, is that we spend most of our time measuring incentives or disincentives and very little time measuring benefits. So over this 4-decade period, about a quarter of the articles were about the benefits of programs, and the rest of the articles were focused on measuring the costs or this disincentive effects of programs. And this seems to, for anybody who's ever taken a public policy class, cost-benefit analysis, it would be akin to trying to decide whether or not a program was effective by only looking at its costs without looking at its benefits. It just doesn't really make sense. But nonetheless, that has really been the background of our research and quite honestly also our policy focus on these programs for a very long time. So what I want to sort of talk about today is sort of what we've learned in the recent times. And so I, in a very low-tech way, just chopped off this graph by just erasing it on my PowerPoint there for you. But now I can show you that in the last decade, the nature of the work that's being done on the social safety net has completely changed. And we now have a setting in which there's about 4 papers on measuring the benefits of programs compared to the papers measuring the cost of the program. So something has changed. And this talk is not about what changed, but instead it's about what have we learned from this last decade of research on what the benefits of the social safety net is for children in the long run in particular, and how should we think about that in terms of sort of current policy context. So what I want to try to convince you of is that we now have a fair amount of evidence that shows that when we give families more resources when children are young, it has a fairly profound effect on where children ends up in adulthood. And so with that, I think we can start to think about the extent to which the social safety net, as a society, we should think about it as an investment in children. And that is not, maybe many of you come from other countries where that's a way that we think about the social safety net. It's certainly not the case of how we have thought about the social safety net in the United States. We don't say we should do this, or we might think about doing this because it could lead to a different future for children or a set of children. We tend to say, should we do this? Is the mom going to stop working if we do this because we give the families a little bit more resources? And that's important. I mean, we need to quantify that. I'm not saying it's not. I've written many papers that quantify how labor supply is affected by the social safety net. But the thing is that that's kind of an incomplete story, an incomplete picture if we don't also know what the benefits are. And if the benefits are big, we may be willing to tolerate larger costs to get those large benefits. If the benefits are small, then maybe those costs are too big, and it's not a good idea to do more of this. And so that's what I want to talk about today. So for the rest of my talk, what I want to do is kind of fill in the gaps a little bit for those of you who don't know these terms, what a social safety net is, what it is in the United States, and so on. And then I'll spend a little bit of time giving you a kind of overview of some of the research I've been doing and others have been doing on trying to quantify this effect on the effects of children in the short and the long run. And then I want to kind of return to the current sort of policy context around the child tax credit that was expanded for 1 year in 2021 and what we might think about that in the context of this research. So, but before I do that, I started this talk with this scatter plot that shows that, the United States has relatively high child poverty and relatively low spending on children. But I don't want to go any further without pointing out that we have made some progress. So if I sort of zoom out and show you a measure of child poverty, up here I've got for children as well as all individuals, pretty much all the way back. We started measuring child poverty in the United States in the early 1960s, so this goes back to that time. And it uses a measure of child poverty that, that encompasses not just cash resources, but tax benefits and in-kind benefits such as food stamps, things of that sort. And that's called the Supplemental Poverty Measure. And it's released by the Census Department every year alongside a very out-of-date measure of poverty that's called the Official Poverty Measure. And I'm not going to talk about that today. But the point of me showing you this graph is to point out that we have made some progress. So child poverty today, or this is all pre-pandemic, is lower than it was in the 60s. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on all the movements of this graph, but suffice it to say that we generally tend to see periods of decline in child poverty when one of two things happen. One, really strong labor markets with rising wages like we've had in the recent past. Two, an expansion of a social safety net. And those are the two factors that are most associated with just the time series pattern of the improvements in child poverty. And there was a very high-profile report that came out recently by Child Trends in Washington, D.C. that tried to call attention to this glass half full kind of statement about where we've made gains, because after all, it should be important for thinking about how we could make more gains. And that got quite a lot of press when it came out. So Jason DeParle at the New York Times wrote a whole series of papers, of pieces, highlighting the results of this, and went to West Virginia to talk to families, to learn about their experience with some of these programs. And so this is just kind of replicating the time series I just showed you, except it only goes back to 1993, so it shows this period of like dramatic decline in child poverty in the sort of mid-1990s, and then a kind of period of pretty flat, not a whole lot changing, but maybe slowly trending downwards, and then a period again of decline. And he's marked some things along here, including the expansion of the earned income tax credit, which has been shown to be a very important determinant of reducing child poverty, welfare reform, economic recessions. And prior to the pandemic, this goes through 2019, the most recent thing that expanded sort of benefits for families with children was actually the 2017 Trump tax cut that included an expansion of the child tax credit, although that didn't affect the very poorest Americans, and I'll talk a bit about that later. So the bottom line is, it's not quite as bad as if you only saw that first slide. I think we know how to reduce child poverty, and we've got some evidence that shows what policies can be effective. Okay, so social safety net, like what is that? What is that term? Generally speaking, we use that term when we talk about a government transfer, where the government transfers some resources, whether it's cash or whether it's some kind of other benefit. It could even include maybe Medicaid and health insurance directly to families. So today, what I'm going to talk about is a somewhat narrower set of all that broad category of the social safety net. I want to focus on my interest here in this conversation is policies that are aimed at children and their families. And then additionally, some elements of the social safety net would include things like Social Security, public pensions. And that's an example of a universal program. It's not a program only available to low-income individuals or families. And I'm going to be primarily focusing on those more targeted programs, policies and programs that are targeted at the lower-income population. So that's just narrowing the set a little bit. So with that sort of definition of the social safety net, how would I characterize the United States social safety net, maybe in particular in thinking about the comparison to other rich countries? I would call out a couple of things. One, it's not universal. So in the United States, we tend to identify certain groups that we're going to target our benefits on demographically. And those tend to be the elderly, the disabled, or children. Those are the three categories where most of these kinds of income assistance programs are targeted. Second, particularly when we're talking about policies for families with children, very little is in cash. There's a deep mistrust that underlies policymakers' interest in not giving cash to low-income families with children. I think it interacts a lot with structural racism in America, and that's a long story that we could spend a whole hour talking about. But the bottom line is we give very little in cash. We tend to do a lot more sort of in-kind food and nutrition programs and tax credits that are typically tied to work. We have a very heavy use of conditionality. And the main form of conditionality that shows up a lot in policies for families with children is working. So starting with welfare reform and the rise of the earned income tax credit, the whole social safety net for families with children, with a few exceptions, was very much one that built on work. And so if you were able to work and keep a regular connection to the labor market, the social safety net might help top up those low wages in a very low wage society such as the United States. But if you're not able to keep that up, then with welfare reform and the rise of the earned income tax credit, it has the potential to leave a lot of families behind without the sort of fundamental safety net of something in the state of the world that you aren't able to work. And then finally, as was shown in the graph earlier, our funding levels are simply just not very high. So, but with that, what are the key things that are part of the US social safety net for children today? So this is data for 2019. Again, just things changed a lot in the pandemic, so I'm going to sort of focus on things through 2019. If you measure the social safety net by the dollars we spend on it, the tax credits are the biggest part of the social safety net, the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. Secondly would be our health programs. Medicaid is also a very large part of our spending on families with children. Third comes kind of cash assistance, Social Security. You know, kids get Social Security. What? They do? How? Because kids live with grandparents, and we measure these things at a family level. There's also some benefits that go to surviving children, but it's primarily because of a kind of household concept of resources. And then we've got our nutrition programs and so on. So that's sort of what the social safety net looks like in the United States. If we change the lens a little bit and say, which programs remove the most children from poverty, you get a slightly different perspective. So the tax credits are still, I mean, it's interesting. Most people don't even know that there are tax credits that help low-income families, yet they're the biggest anti-poverty program in America, the earned income tax credit and, to a lesser extent, the child tax credit. The second biggest anti-poverty programs in the United States are the food stamps, or SNAP, what's called SNAP now. And then you can see some of the others down below. So with this sort of motivation of the tax credits and food stamps, I'm going to focus my review of what do we know about these programs in terms of their benefits on those two buckets. So, you know, you might kind of have a conversation with someone about, say, introducing a pre-K program in your city. And people might have a discussion like, well, why should we do this? Like, let's talk about whether this is good policy. You usually pretty quickly in that conversation get to a point where you say, well, this is going to cost us some money as a city to expand our K through 12 system to include pre-K, for example. But it may pay off because kids are going to enter kindergarten more ready to learn, and then that's going to put them on an upward trajectory, and that's going to be good for the kids, and it also might be good for us as a city because it may be that there'll be fewer challenges in terms of educating these children later in their childhood. And so we very commonly think about education programs with this investment lens. In other words, we pay today and it reaps returns in the future. That's basically thinking about investment. But that sort of lens hasn't been very commonly used in thinking about the social safety net. But to the extent to which spending more money on low-income families with children, if that changes a kid's completed education, their earnings in adulthood, that's going to be obviously good for the child, and so that might be a good reason for this investment. But if you need to convince more folks that this is a good idea, you might also want to know, from the government's perspective, that this might be a good thing for government as well. Because you spend some money today, you're going to spend less money in the future. You're going to have more tax revenues. You're going to have less spending on social supports. If people are healthier in their adulthood, we'll be spending less on Medicare when people get there. And so that's sort of the motivation for thinking about whether or not we can wrangle this data and these programs in order to learn something about that question. So this is a little bit of a schematic of what I think we've learned, and then I'll get into some more detail. So we've learned a lot from that graph I showed you about all those papers that have been written. On the left side are the different programs that have been studied in this way. The tax credits, food stamps. There's some earlier work by my co-authors, Anna and Adriana, working on the Mother's Pension Program, which existed before the Social Security Act in 1935, very early cash welfare in the United States. There's a lot of work on Medicaid and other kinds of income interventions. So there's a lot of work on a lot of the key programs for families with children. And then on the right-hand side is the kinds of things that we've begun to quantify in that work. And I would say that what we have are like at 2 points in time that are pretty far apart. So we often get evidence about health at birth because we've got really good data on births. So the idea is if the mom gets more resources when she's pregnant, is her baby healthier at birth? And the answer tends to be yes, pretty consistently. There's some evidence on child health, food insecurity, some evidence on how kids are doing in school, measured by test scores, such as that is. And then a lot of time goes by, and then we find these kids again in the administrative data, and we tend to be able to quantify things such as, what is your completed education? What is your labor market earnings and income? Where do you live? Do you own a house? What are the characteristics of the neighborhood that you live in? Do you have any connection to the criminal justice system? What is your health in adulthood? What is your mortality? How long is your life? These are the kinds of range of outcomes that we've been able to quantify, not for everything on this list on the left, but for a lot. And so before going into a little bit of summary of that, why might early life resources matter? Why might it change your human capital, your completed education, your ability to earn, your health in adulthood? Well, I think this is one area where we really don't know very much, and I think there's many different possibilities of what could be the mechanism. But one thing that's raised often is this fetal origins hypothesis, which posits, originally starting in developmental biology, that there's a relationship between exposure to good nutrition and other kinds of environmental bad things in utero and in early life that may have sort of a permanent imprint on our physiology that has an impact on our health in adulthood as well as our economic well-being. And the very earliest research on the fetal origins hypothesis came from the study of famines. But since then, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of papers in economics showing a connection between pollution and other kinds of things in early life and the relationship between that and where kids end up in the long run. So one kind of lens to think about with respect to why spending more on children could make a difference in the long run comes from that sort of idea. There's a lot of really important work going on right now about stress, like the stress, metabolic stresses having to do with poverty and conditions of maybe neighborhoods that are less healthy, and the impact that that can have on kids in the long run. And so changing resources in the household may operate through a stress trajectory for the children as well as potentially for their parents. And of course, there's many other pathways that, additional resources can lead to what families do, what they spend the money on, and so on. And this is one of the things we don't know very much about, and I think we have a lot more to learn about the why. Today is really more about the if and the what, but not about the why. So I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of a summary of some of the work that I've been doing over, 15 years on the food stamp program. And I have to say that I realized in thinking about this and meeting with you today, Charles Stoker out there, a student of mine from UC Davis, who actually was a research assistant on some of this work. He now is a tenured professor at the School of Public Health here at Tulane. So this is work that I've been doing for some time, and now I'm really just trying to put it together to try to understand what it all means together. So I have a bunch of papers with different co-authors that are all in some way asking the question, how does providing more nutritional assistance through this food stamp program, which has been around in the United States nationwide since the mid-70s, how does it affect, sort of where children end up in their adulthood through thinking about this sort of long-term thing? So for those of you who don't know what food stamps is, it is an income condition program. You need to have low income to be eligible, and you get vouchers, today distributed through EBT cards, where you can basically buy anything in the grocery store. So it's very fungible, it's very close to cash, but technically it's a voucher program. And it really, in my mind, is the closest thing to a sort of universal safety net in the United States, because if you're poor, you're eligible for food stamps, with a couple important exceptions around immigrants and some work requirements for single adults. So I don't want to minimize that, but relative to the rest of the social safety net, it's a pretty big tent of allowable eligibility. How big is it? Well, it's about $4 per person per day. So that's what you get from food stamps on average. And interestingly, like many programs in the Great Society period, it wasn't rolled out nationwide at one time for interesting reasons, I think. And it turns out that the food stamp program took about 15 years to go from the earliest counties that got this new federal program that's fully federal, paid federally through the USDA. It was about 15 years from the early 60s to the mid-70s when this program was made available across the United States. And so this map, the lighter shaded areas are areas that came in earlier, and the darker shaded areas are areas that came in later. And there's some interesting things here. Like before I saw this data, I would have assumed, by knowing American history, that the places where food stamps would come less would probably be in the parts of the United States that have lower levels of funding for the poor more generally, and I'm sitting in one of those places. But it doesn't really follow those patterns, which is interesting. I'd be happy to talk about that in the Q&A. And I think it has some interaction to do with pre-existing agricultural distribution in the United States. Interesting stuff we could talk about. But what this gives us is sort of a nice experiment where we've got different places in the United States, some places that got food stamps a lot earlier than others. And if I was just giving a seminar on this paper, I'd have to spend a lot of time convincing you that that's kind of as good as random. I don't have time for that today, so you just have to take my word for it. But it's a pretty random process by which these policies were rolled out across the United States. And so what we do is look at adults today, or in modern data, and if I know where they were born and when they were born, I can sort of give an intent to treat estimate of how much of their childhood and when they would have had access to food stamps. So if I was born in a place where food stamps didn't come in until I was 8 years old, I can compare me to other people who were born in the same year but happened to be born in a different part of the country where food stamps was available earlier. And that sort of a cross-county over time variation is what we leverage. to look at outcomes today, where now these folks are like in their 50s. So that's what we do. So let me show you a little bit of those findings. So the first finding on the benefit side that we did was on birth weight. So we basically compared mothers. Some lived in counties where there was a food stamp program when they were pregnant, and others lived in counties that didn't have a food stamp program. And we matched that to the health of their baby at birth, where we know there's a pretty strong connection between nutrition, other sorts of things during the in utero period, and infant health. And what we found was having access to food stamps improved birth outcomes, particularly for the lowest birth weight babies, and more so for African American mothers than for white mothers. So that was the first finding. So resources matter. It's a very short-run measure, but it's, it has some predictive power for future outcomes. In the same sort of bucket of short-run impacts of the food stamp program, Chloe East, using a somewhat different identification strategy, finds very strong evidence of what I would call not short-term, not long-term, but medium-term. So children having more access to SNAP in their early life, say between birth and age 5, when they're in regular school, they're more likely to be present at school and report a reduction in the incidence of poor health. So something there. Then fast forward to the long run. And so in a paper with Diane Schanzenbach and Doug Almond published in the American Economic Review, we asked the question, how does access to food stamps in childhood affect health in adulthood? And in this paper, we focused in particular on metabolic health. And metabolic health, the measure that we were able to put together in our data, is a combination of high blood pressure, diabetes, obesity, heart disease, and so on. And you might say, Hilary, why did you measure those things? Why metabolic health? Well, it turns out that that's a very strong prediction of this Barker hypothesis, this fetal origins hypothesis, that better nutrition in early life shows up in terms of better metabolic health in adulthood. And we can talk about what the theory is about why that is. And it has to do with the sort of plasticity of the metabolic system when it's developing. And so a very strong prediction from that fetal origins hypothesis is if kids have access to better nutrition, particularly in early childhood, they should be at lower risk for these costly health conditions in adulthood. Okay, so that's the hypothesis. And so what graph is this, and how does it relate to this hypothesis? So on the vertical axis is something that I would call event time. But it's event time in terms of measuring how old were you, or this person in our data, when food stamps became available in their county of birth. Okay, so that's what's on the horizontal axis. This is estimates of a regression model, but I'm just going to talk you through the graph. And what we're looking at is an index of metabolic health. So the units on the vertical axis are standard deviation units. So 0.1 is an increase of 0.1 standard deviations of this index of metabolic health. It's hard to know about the magnitudes there, but even just think about it as positive or negative. And so like any event time, it has to be relative to something being 0. And so we chose to have our sort of 0 point at age 10 or 11, because we came into this thinking that the theory tells us it should be particularly important in early childhood, because that's what the fetal origins hypothesis is about. But this is all relative. That's not important. It's just a scalar. So follow me on this journey of this event study graph as we move from the right to the left. And as we move towards younger ages, we're looking at the difference in what? Your risk of bad metabolic health in adulthood as you live in a place where you got access to food stamps a bit earlier in your childhood. And so those first few dots, 12, 10, 11, 8, 9, 6, 7, 4 to 5, it's kind of flat. And so what that says is having access to food stamps starting at age 12 versus 8 years earlier at age 4 doesn't change your metabolic health outcomes very much. But starting somewhere around this kind of preschool years, you start to see a very different pattern. And it almost looks like a dose response. In other words, it's sort of linear. So a little bit more access to food stamps, a little bit better metabolic health, because metabolic health is bad, so this going down means better metabolic health, less risk of obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease. And so it sort of goes down, and then in this last few dots is sort of like a placebo test. So it shouldn't matter if food stamps was in place 5 years before I was born or 3 years before I was born. I got it my whole life, or I had access to it. And so the fact that it flattens out here at the end is actually really awesome. It's really great. It makes you more confident that this isn't just some other trend that's driving this. Because we wouldn't expect my metabolic health in adulthood to be any different if food stamps had been around 5 years or 3 years before I was born. So that took a little bit of words, but I'm going to show you some more graphs, so I'm going to get some more mileage out of it. But the bottom line is, what this says is, food stamp leads to an improvement in your health in adulthood, and it seems to be particularly important in those early years. In a recent paper with Martha Bailey, Maya Rawson-Slater, and Reed Walker, we expanded our set of outcome variables and used a much bigger data set to look at this problem with a bit of a broader lens. And so we were able to look at outcomes like completed education, earnings, income, poverty in adulthood, the neighborhood that you live in, connections with the criminal justice system, and so on. So a much broader set of outcome variables. And in the end, we found a very similar pattern across these outcomes. So this is a very similar graph to what I just showed you. Because we had a lot more data, we're able to measure this event time, age at which food stamps was introduced, more finely, because we had much bigger samples. But we're doing essentially the same thing in a regression setting. And what this outcome is human capital. So it's completed, again, it's all in index form with standard deviations. I'm going to give you some actual magnitudes so you can get a sense of how big these are in just a few slides. But I want to start by just showing you the time pattern. And so what you see here is the same sort of pattern. Access to food stamps, particularly in early childhood, leads to an improvement in this case, education. So having more food stamps in early childhood, better education. Having more food stamps in early childhood leads to fairly consistent effects in improved residential location. The poverty rate of the neighborhood that you live in, whether or not you live in a single-family home, a lot of other measures, the Chetty measure of the quality of the location for upward mobility, et cetera. A very consistent finding. Better nutrition leads to this better measure of your ability to live in a better neighborhood in adulthood. So to give you some idea about the magnitudes of these results, I'm listing a few things here. And so these magnitudes are associated with going from no access to food stamps to having access to food stamps throughout that critical conception to age 5 range. Leads to an 11% reduction in mortality, a 0.5 percentage point increase in not being incarcerated, a 6% increase in having some college attendance, a 7% increase in earnings. I mean, these are not wildly large numbers, but they aggregate up across a wide population over many years of adulthood compared to a relatively short amount of spending in childhood. So somewhat less deeply, I'm looking at the time, I want to tell you about the Earned Income Tax Credit and what we've learned from this work. So the earned income tax credit requires you to have earnings to get it. And through various tax reforms, it's expanded a lot over the years. And so many different research teams have used the variation in these tax reforms to study the effects of the earned income tax credit, including the long-run impacts. So let me show you a few things from that. Along with Doug Miller and David Simon, we looked at the effects of, again, the mother having access to food stamps when their earned income tax credit when she's pregnant, and the effect on birth outcomes. And we find again that more resources during pregnancy leads to improvements in infant health. In a recent paper that's forthcoming in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, they used this incredible data that merges exposure to the child tax credit in early childhood to adult earnings through the tax data for the United States, and find that having access to this earned income tax credit in the first year of life in a kind of regression discontinuity model that has to do with the fact that you only get the credit if the kid is born by the end of the tax year. So you can sort of compare kids that are born in December to January, and those that are born in December get sort of one more year of this earned income tax credit than the kids born in January. Very simple, straightforward design. And what they find is that that 1 year of additional access to the earned income tax credit leads to an increase in earnings in adulthood that seem to be growing with age. So the oldest kids here are in their mid-30s. More tax credit, higher earnings in adulthood. Again, we don't really know the why. I sort of told you that already. This is really just about the what. There's also a much larger range of studies, including showing that when there are more resources available through the earned income tax credit, kids do a bit better in school on standardized tests. And they also show, in a more accumulative sense, an increase in educational attainment and employment and earnings in adulthood. So, oh yeah, very quickly, there's also like other work from other settings. Randy Aki and his co-authors have some amazing work that's using information from tribal government UBI-like programs that tend to come from casino revenue, and studying that on the impacts of kids in these settings, and finding quite dramatic impacts in the long run on kids who have access to more resources through this kind of UBI that many tribal governments have been using. Stay tuned for a new paper that he has out on that. Okay, so with all of that, like, how does that get to what I was talking about at the beginning in this kind of investment lens? Well, there's a very kind of helpful measure that a paper by Hendren and Sprung-Kieser sort of popularized, maybe is the right word, called the marginal value of public funds. And basically what it is a ratio of benefits in the numerator and costs in the denominator. And the bigger that ratio is, the better the investment the policy is. But the only thing I want to call your attention to, the benefits are pretty straightforward. They're the things that are of value to the family. My child has a healthier, longer life. That's going to generate benefits for the families. But the cost in the denominator is not just the cost of what those food stamp benefits cost the government, but also the impacts on the budget in the short and the long run. So if I do some spending through a program that causes parents to work a bit less, that program has become more expensive. And so we need to build that into our cost measure. But in addition, if spending in this program leads to a reduction in government costs in the future, we got to measure that one as well. And so this net government cost measure has some things that make it bigger and some things that make it smaller, taking into account these benefits of the program in the long run. But at the end of the day, it's a ratio of benefits relative to costs. So if we take all of these studies that I told you about on the food stamp program, we get, wait for it, we get a marginal value of public funds of 62. So what that says is, for every dollar that we spend on food stamps, it generates, no, that's not quite right. for every dollar that a program costs, it generates $62 in terms of benefits for the children. And the benefits that in the numerator are the children have higher earnings, they have lower mortality, and so on. But the key thing is these long-run effects that make the children have the higher earnings in adulthood have a feedback effect of lowering the costs in the denominator. So just by comparison, if we were to just not measure any of those long-run benefits, we never did those studies, so all we had is we're spending money on this program, and how much more does it cost because it discourages labor supply? We would get a benefit to cost ratio of 0.69. Not so good. We spend $1 and we only get 69 cents in benefits. So this is a pretty big difference by quantifying in the long run. And I highly recommend for those who have never looked at it, this Hendren and Sprung-Kieser paper basically calculates this marginal value of public funds for hundreds of studies and shows that many, many programs that are targeted at children, more so than those targeted at adults, lead to quite high benefit to cost ratios. And some of the best bang for your buck turns out to be Medicaid spending. Almost pays for itself in the long run by providing health insurance for children. So let me finish by getting back to the present and talking about the relevance of this for sort of current policy discussions. So, in the very first graph, I showed you that, we're not very big spenders with respect to child poverty, yet we did something pretty dramatic in 2021. As part of the American Rescue Plan, we expanded the child tax credit in a quite dramatic way in the United States. And so let me just tell you about that and what I think how it's relevant for this conversation. So we've had a child tax credit for a long time, since 1997. But the child tax credit has always been one that has a very high minimum income requirement that doesn't just require that you work, but you need to earn a fair amount in order to get to that maximum benefit. And so it was last expanded in 2017. And so this is what the credit schedule looked like in 2017 and in 2020 and today in 2022. A household can get up to $2,000 per child. And you can earn, if you're a single parent, up to $200,000 a year and get that $2,000 per child. But if you earn $5,000 per year, you don't get this benefit. So it's a benefit that has a pretty high minimum income requirement that working sort of full-time at the national minimum wage almost gets you to that, to earning up to that $2,000 benefit. So, you're talking to someone at a cocktail party and you study the child tax credit, such as I do, and they say, oh, tell me about that child tax credit. And I say, yeah, well, we have this policy. It's meant to try to help families cover the costs of taking care of children. And then you tell them that 2% of families in America, of children, have incomes that are too high and they're not eligible for the full $2,000. Okay, that tells you it's a pretty high income cutoff. But fully 35% of children live in families whose income is too low to get this benefit. And the person you're talking to is like, that sounds crazy. Why do we have a policy like that? And you say, I don't know. I'm just an economist. I don't know how these policy decisions are made, but it does seem pretty crazy. So that's what we had. And then as part of this 2021 COVID-era American Rescue Plan, that was changed, and two critical things happened in 2021. One, we made it more generous. It went from $2,000 to $3,600 if your kid was under age 6, which I think was a nod to this research that shows that it's particularly strong investment when you do these things early in life. That's the first thing. The second thing, which is much more important, is we took away the minimum income requirement, and you now could get access to this benefit even if you had $0. So it's really the first unconditional cash-like benefit that we have ever had in the history of child poverty in the United States. And so the question is, what do we know about it? What I could tell you is that if made permanent, this policy would be by far the biggest thing we ever did for child poverty, reducing it by maybe 35%, and would be sort of similar to what Social Security did for elder poverty in the United States before we had Social Security, when in 1930, 1925, it was our elder members of our society that had the highest poverty rates. These days, it's children. So going back to that first graph, my best estimate of where that puts us is it makes some progress. We move a little bit. We're now closer to Portugal as opposed to near Turkey and Mexico and Spain. But it just kind of gives you a sense of like, this is a very big push, but it still doesn't get us very close to either the lower poverty rates or the higher spending rates of other countries. Interestingly, the debate about the child tax credit still came down to this. For those of you who remember, Joe Manchin said, I can't support this in the long run because I'm worried it's going to make moms not work. And that's not good. So all of this work, and at the end of the day, we ended up in the same place we always do, which is debating how much the program is going to affect parents. But I will say, and here I'm back to being my optimistic self, I will say that there was a lot more mention that these policies can improve outcomes for kids in the long run. So I throw up a few headlines from some pieces that were written about it at the time. So what we know from kind of real-time research on this policy that was around in 2021 and then expired is that poverty rates declined when these checks started to drop, and they increased when they stopped. Food insecurity or food insufficiency, somewhat different measures, dropped quite dramatically when these checks started to drop. There's 3 or 4 papers that have looked at the effects on employment and earnings of parents, finding either no impact on employment or one paper finding a small negative impact on employment. The most recent annual census poverty numbers came out just a couple of months ago and measured the lowest child poverty rate in US history at 5.2%. And the graph on the left shows you how much of that decline in child poverty was because of the child tax credit expansion. And there was a lot of press about that at the time. So I'm about ready to end. Where does this take us? I know there's a lot of numbers here, and I'm absolutely not going to walk you through these numbers. But there was a really nice piece done by the Columbia Child Poverty and Social Poverty Center, Social Policy Center, that tried to quantify this child tax credit and its benefits in the long run, given all this research on similar policies. And their ultimate quantification was that this increase in the child tax credit would lead to over $800 billion in benefits relative to $16 billion in increase in costs. So that sounds like a pretty good return on investment. So let me just stop here, and I'd be happy to take questions. And I will leave you with this as a backdrop of some of the things that I think are really open questions that we still need to learn a lot more about. So thanks very much for coming today, and I hope you enjoy the conversation.
We're going to have a Q&A, and for those who need to go ahead and leave, feel free. We have a mic right there if anybody wants to queue up, and Hilary will entertain questions, or if anyone doesn't have any questions, you can just stand up and ask questions. But we do have a mic there if you want to queue to ask questions. talk about child poverty, but isn't child poverty a map of family poverty? So it seems to me that this is a type of mapping of another issue, which would be families in poverty. How do you speak to that? What do you say exactly?
So the most important thing to point out about that, and you're absolutely right, is children don't have income. So we're not looking at children's income. Obviously, children live in households that have resources. And we measure poverty, most countries do, we do and most countries do, on a household basis or a family basis. And so you basically take everybody who's living together that's related, and you add up all of the resources they all have, and you count everybody in the household, and it's that kind of combination of the resources available and the people in the household, and then the whole household is either poor or not poor. So that's the assumption, that everybody is sharing resources in a household. So when a child is poor, that means their parents are poor as well, and that's absolutely true. But because all children are in families, but not all adults are with children, I focus on child poverty because that's the unit that I'm interested in. And if you look at the poverty rate of just prime-aged adults, you'd see it's very low. But I think that masks the fact that many adults live in families with children, and those families tend to be poor. But it's everybody has that same. So you're right, mapping into the household is exactly right.
If I may, dominate the time, no one else has stood up, so clearly I can go again. We know that people in poverty have these periods of poverty, right, where once you enter into poverty, the likelihood that you're going to have another and longer sustained period of poverty therefore increases, right? So once we see this trend, we see people popping in and out. How is that accounted for, that you might catch someone in a point in time where they're out of poverty? But that doesn't mean that the long-run trends or durations of poverty episodes couldn't be extended over a lifetime.
For sure. Everything that I showed you today are snapshots. And that's not great, because it misses a lot. There's many things it misses. It misses. This isn't what you asked, but just kind of speaking to the limitations of the measures I used today, a lot of people criticize the poverty rate because it misses something about, well, how deep in poverty are you? Not everybody that's poor is in the same situation. So that's one way that it's not adequate. But the second way, I think you're absolutely right, is it's a snapshot, and it's not saying anything about the length of time, how much of my childhood did I experience poverty, and we know a bit less about that, mostly because our data is better for snapshots than it is longitudinally. But I think the data we have available suggests that the long-term negative consequences of being poor is worse when the period of poverty is deeper or longer. So that's 100%, I think, well established in the literature. It's just we don't have as good data to kind of show that at the level that I did today. So you're absolutely right about that. And I think that that's not only important from a measurement exercise, I think it's quite important for diagnosing what the best solution is. Because there are certain things that I think we need on just a perpetual basis. And so just having a stable and predictable source of assistance that you're not worried you're going to lose because your income goes up by a little bit or your income goes down provides a pretty important floor that households can count on and make their budgeting with it in mind. So I think it is important for many reasons.
So I know you said you didn't want to talk about this, but you have early on this really provocative indictment, I think, of the whole econ profession, where we go from measuring the costs of these programs to measuring the benefits of these programs, and you have the lines crossing over. And I was thinking two things. One is that is that just driven by data, and then because linking people across time is tough, and then second, kind of matching that with the graph you have that compares the U.S. to other countries, does that graph look the same when you look at other countries that have easier access to flipping data, right? And so I don't know if you could talk about that.
Yeah. Your hypothesis about data is a very common one, and I do think that obviously you can't, without the right data, we couldn't do this. So I would say it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. I don't think that it's the whole story because, you know, the panel study of income dynamics has been around for a really long time. And is it the perfect data? Is it the same as using tax data? Heck no. But you can do it, and like my first paper on this used that because we didn't have the access to the tax data earlier. We tell a story, but it's just a story, that I think that there was a really important period when, I mean, I'm prone to hyperbole, so yeah, it was a little bit of an indictment of the economics profession, but myself, like, I've been studying child poverty since I got my PhD in '92. I'm the same person, I mean, I wasn't studying it. So this is just, the question is like, why were we not thinking about it? I think we just weren't thinking about it. And for me, where the light bulb went off is when I saw these papers on the long-term, like Doug Allman's flu paper, and then all the many papers that came after that showed that all these different impacts of things that happened in early childhood, which were mostly negative. Think about all that literature. It's about famines. It's about bad weather that makes the crops not good, and all these pollution, and all these different papers that consistently showed that these early years of life were really a vulnerable period, and if kids were exposed to a bad shock, it impacted them in the long run. And one day I just thought, wait a second. If that's true, then maybe doing the opposite and creating a positive shock might impact things in the long run. So I don't know, that's my own journey. And Anna and Adriana sort of had a similar journey. So literally we wrote this paper, which is just like sitting in an armchair and speculating. It's not a, you know, it's not a, there's nothing much sharper than that in there. So I do think that it's a little bit of a story about how the literature evolved, but the data obviously is necessary to do this work. So I don't know, those are my 2 cents.
I'm thinking about the interaction between programs like SNAP versus a program like the EITC that's delivered through the tax system. And I guess I have 2 kind of thoughts about it, and I was wondering about your thoughts too. So first, in terms of the distribution of social safety net programs that are delivered through the tax system, do you have any sense of how the US compares to other developed countries and how that might interact with the graph you showed at the very beginning? And then second, do you get a sense that there's a different, I suppose, efficacy of safety net programs that are delivered through a tax system, especially in the US where it would be essentially a lump sum at one point in the year,
yeah, versus
a benefit that is monthly, like SNAP or something like
yeah.
that?
Almost everything you said, I think, are really good questions that I don't know. I mean, I could speculate, and you can try to like link things together from different papers, but we don't know very much about that. You bring up, just to bring up one thing, the lump sum versus the every month. We don't really have an experiment that allows us to kind of analyze the difference. And if you were to compare SNAP to the EITC, too many other things would be different. So it's a little bit hard, or I haven't figured out a way to do that, but I'm sure that we'll learn more about that in the long run. And SNAP distributionally targets a poorer population than the EITC does. So we might expect that the sort of investment effects, I think, would be more when you have less income on the base. So there's many different things that make them different. So I don't think that we really know the answer to that. But there was one other thing in your question that I've now forgotten. I should have written it down. What was the other piece? Oh, about the tax system.
Yeah.
So interestingly, or maybe it's not surprising to anyone in this room, the United States uses the tax system for redistribution more than anyone else. And I think the reason is Americans don't like programs, and so we can do these things, people don't see it, they're not negatively reacting to it. I think that's why. It's very buried. It's like like Suzanne Mettler has this book called The Submerged State. It's like submerged, you can't really see it. We know what those graphs look like, but most people don't. And so I think that there's a reason why we do it. And I think it also, I'm not an expert on this, but I think it also might have something to do with how they do the cost estimates at CBO. in terms of when it's in the reducing, how it affects taxes versus spending, that I think makes it more attractive. But maybe there's someone in this room who knows more about that than me. But the thing that I think is more kind of pedestrian that is relevant is that when we deliver things through the tax system, it kind of increases the burden of getting it. And in particular, for low-income families or individuals, you don't have to you're not legally required to file taxes until your earnings get to a certain point where you're due taxes. And so if we're trying to get some resources, particularly this expanded child tax credit, to the poorest families who don't have a regular relationship with submitting taxes, we've got kind of a high hill to get up. And so most countries distribute their child tax credits, they call them child allowances, and they're typically distributed through the Social Security system. Once your kid is born and you've got a Social Security number for them, I don't know, maybe some people in this audience come from countries where they remember getting this. And then there it is, and it's just there in perpetuity. And they tend to be fairly universal and not this like phase out with income. And so it's just a part of the kind of Social Security system without much effort required by families in order to apply for it. And historically, the United States has tended to make it hard to get things with the idea that only the truly deserving will end up with it. And I could give that as a talk the next time you invite me in 10 years. There's a huge amount of work that shows that that theory might have been completely wrong. And that in fact, the higher the bar to get people to apply for things, the more likely the people that are gonna lose out are those who just don't have the ability with all the stresses in their life in order to get over that bar. And so we may actually be doing selection the exact opposite way from the way we would like. So I do think it's actually somewhat profound that we do it through the tax system.
Hi. You mentioned having an interesting explanation for the geographic rollout of the food stamps. I was wondering if you could just go into that a little bit.
Yeah, so it's interesting that this main program is out of the USDA, which you don't think is like a program that provides a redistribution, but it does because food stamps is so important. And it turns out that when it was first started, it was basically replacing something called the Commodity Distribution Program, which was primarily a farm support program. So it operated thusly. The USDA would buy commodities from farmers in order to basically support prices. And then as long as the government had this, they would, well, we might as well give it to someone if we have it. And so like where I grew up in Wisconsin, we called it government cheese because it's the dairy state. Most of the agriculture was dairy. And so the USDA would buy all of this dairy to prop up the price of milk for the farmers. And then as long as they had it, they would give the dairy and the cheese and the butter to low-income families. And so when the food stamp program was rolled out, counties could apply for it. So they would have to send a report to USDA saying, we hear there's this new program and we want it. But they would have to give up their commodity distribution program. And so it ended up being, I think, largely driven by the pitting of agricultural interests who liked the old program and interests for the poor. And so you tended to see cities in more northern areas moving sooner. And you think of New England as a very kind of progressive place, but agriculture was really important there. And so New England was, for example, much slower. And I don't know the full story for the South because clearly there's a lot of farming in the South, but I don't have good data on this. It might be that there was less of this commodity distribution program was less important in this part of the country. So that's the story of why the rollout kind of figured out the way it did.
Hey, Hilary. Great talk. Really enjoyed it. I want to get your thoughts on like whether or not you think these modified kind of cost-benefit figures are still being underreported due to kind of positive intergenerational benefits that would result from kind of like, having people be more educated, earn higher incomes, they can pass that stuff on to their kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As I like to say, this is like the tip of the iceberg. I mean, just to talk about my work on SNAP, these guys we haven't even quantified much of the health. The government is a big payer in health, as I'm sure everybody here knows. And certainly once everybody gets 65, this is everybody's on Medicare. And so no one has started to quantify the benefits of like better health in terms of the government expenditures on health. And that's just one example. So, and I think you raise another example. I mean, there's actually a recent paper by Marianne Page, Chloe East, Sarah Miller, and Laura Weary that is a 3-generation analysis of the Medicaid. And so it goes as follows. We already knew that if a mom was pregnant and had Medicaid, health insurance, she gave birth to a healthier baby. They now are following that baby into adulthood, who then has a baby, and what is the health of their baby? And there's a very strong effect that goes through that next generation, that making the grandmother have access to Medicaid when she's pregnant leads to a healthier birth of her grandchild. And that's the first 3-generation quantification that I've seen of these kinds of things. So I think that as we do more work, it's mostly going to show up in the benefit column. We pretty much already know what the costs are. And so I think that these kind of measures are only going to look more advantageous towards this as an investment than what we know today.
So I saw on one of the slides there, it mentioned that you testified before Congress about this recently, and I was just curious, given the mounting evidence on the benefits of these programs, what is your outlook for the potential for policy change around this?
So it's funny, I don't know if Steve Scheffrin is still here, but when we were at lunch today, he said, Hillary, the title of your talk sounds a lot like Joe Biden's policy. Like all that talk about the Build Back Better plan was really like this, right? And I said, well, I think that's because they got some good people in the government, and I think that they've been listening, and this work is out there. So I think it is true that it made its way into the debate a little bit, and the reason why I testified before Congress is the House Budget Committee had a couple of staffers. They knew about this work, and they were part of the enterprise that would have been pushing Build Back Better through, which didn't happen, but they're playing a long game. And they said, we know that this work is out there, and we want it in the congressional record that, that there's research that shows that spending more today, leads to these benefits in the long run. And so they set up a hearing and invited me and a couple of other people to speak on this issue. And they knew that there was no legislation, there was nothing going on, but they wanted to start to just build the record that this is here. And I think if somebody were to do like a textural analysis of maybe what people say on the floor of the House, I think you would see more of this language starting to work its way in to how people talk about these programs. And I think that has to be good. And I've been thinking for a long time, putting on my policy hat, not my economist hat, that for the longest time we've been in this standstill where people who support these programs say we got to reduce child poverty, it's the right thing to do, and the people who don't say, but it's just going to make the family situation worse because people aren't going to work, and that's bad. And so I feel like there's a middle ground that can we all agree that it would be good if kids were better in the long run, and could this help break that old debate? So I don't know, but I know that the next window for policy is either they're talking about it I'm not I don't really follow policy that closely. I'm not an expert, but apparently there's some horse trading that might go on in the lame duck session with the child tax credit against something that the Republicans want on research and development that is part of Trump's tax plan that's only kind of upcoming, and firms don't want it. And if not that, in 2025, the Trump tax plan that reduced corporate tax and increased the child tax credit hits a 5-year, it disappears if they don't take action. So I don't know. We'll see.
So I was just thinking that when you quantify child poverty, I guess you don't differentiate between children of citizens and children of illegal immigrants. However, most of the benefits seem to be conditional on your parents being citizens, because I guess if you're an illegal immigrant, you don't have social security number or you don't pay taxes. So is there any reason why it has to be that way? Or is it, I don't know, why does the social safety net conditions on the legal status of your parents? That's just a question.
Yeah, that's a deep question. And I think it has, that's a long-standing, huge limitation in the social safety net in the United States. Some benefits, it only depends on the child characteristics. So for example, a child can be eligible for SNAP if they're a citizen, regardless of the rest of their family around them. But it tends to be hard to get those families on these programs because there's a lot of confusion about it. And particularly in the modern era, there's a lot of concern, starting from the public charge that Trump was leading, about sort of being in the system at all. And so it's really a problem in these mixed status families to try to get eligible children the benefits that they're eligible for. And I think that this just has to do with Americans, views about, I mean, we don't have immigration reform. We don't have a stable system. Some states, like California, has now made Medicaid available to all people in the state. They started with elders and moved down, regardless of citizenship, that they're paying out of California, not federal funds, because you can't use federal funds for that. And have also done some expansions of some other benefits to make access, but it's the federal limitations that are the constraint on the federal funds. And I don't know how many other states are doing this. I just happen to know this because it's the state that I live in. But I think you identify, I just want to say back, if I were to show you what these child poverty rates look like differently for citizen and non-citizen children, you would see, and mixed status families, you would see dramatic differences. And because they're so excluded from so much of what we do, you don't see the improvement that you do for other kids. Full stop.
Do you think there's been a historical trend at which point a cost-benefit analysis posed to the government, when they finally look at it and say, okay, this is finally enough benefit to the cost?
I don't know. I wish I knew more about how these things actually happen. And I don't know of any research that shows that there's some point at which, okay, we all agree now that this is a good thing to do. Because I think a lot of evidence is just not taken into account, period. And so you just make your argument about what you're trying to support or not support, and don't have to do anything more than that. So I don't know what it would take to try to bring more evidence into the discussions. And I guess that's probably a question more for political scientists than an economist. So that's a bit of a discouraging answer.
So on your graphs, it looks like the countries that have the lowest child poverty have universalistic welfare programs, universalistic welfare states. And Americans don't like that, as you've alluded to. But say there was a marginal value of public funds analysis, and it showed that increased spending on public goods like tap water or education was really effective for reducing child poverty. Do you think Americans would be more easily lobbied on that than social spending in terms of programs?
I'm sure you would see that lead abatement would have a huge marginal value of public funds. I don't know if that's been quantified. I don't think it always translates very well, but I want to pull out one thing of what you said. Translates very well to changes in policy, although I know we're making progress on that. For a long time, this debate about targeted versus universal programs has landed on, well, we should do it targeted, because if we've got a limited budget, let's at least target it to the families who are most in need. And so that's sort of the social safety net that the US is built on. And I'm starting to wonder, although I don't have evidence to back it up, whether that has gotten us in this world where, because we've done targeting based on income, that has led to a sort of us versus them perspective on the social safety net that I think interacting with structural racism in America has led us to a place of perpetual disinvestment in those targeted programs, because the majority group doesn't see themselves as benefiting from them, even though that's of course false. And so people are starting to think about, well, maybe it's worth the additional cost of the program to have programs be more universal so that everybody's in it, like Social Security, even though there's a lot of redistribution inside Social Security, and that could lead to the lack of disinvestment in the future or the more support of the program. And I think that was actually behind the idea of the child tax credit the way it was. And the idea was, well, if we make everybody get the benefits, then everybody's in it together, and it'll be popular, and then that'll be what it allows it to perpetuate. And for some reason, that didn't happen. And I think there'll be a lot of papers written about trying to understand why that didn't work the way we expected. But I know there's a recent piece that Brookings put out trying to really make this argument that this old, that we don't know as much about our universal programs more sustaining in the long run, or our targeted programs, disinvested. I think we have more to learn about that, but I think it's kind of an important thing at the intersection of political science, which I know you're studying, and economics that I think is really important and understudied.
So for the second time, let's make this the last question.
Oh, I don't get up yet. All right, awesome. Yeah. No, so that's kind of on my list of one of the things that we don't know is how these programs interact. And we tend to study them one at a time. An interesting side note in this work that I did on the long run effects of food stamps is the effects of food stamps on children's outcomes like earnings and poverty in adulthood are very much concentrated among the white children and not the black children in our data. And so in a follow-up study, which we're sort of trying to put together now, we're trying to understand to what extent you need to have good schools and maybe other environmental characteristics in order to translate those additional resources into outcomes in adulthood. So that's just like one interaction effect, but another interaction effect is multiple programs. Does it make a difference? Can we just add them up, or are there multiplier effects, or maybe the opposite when you combine them? And it's just hard because we need something to get a causal estimate, and getting two instruments together, as we know, is difficult. But I am sure that going forward, a lot of smart people are going to figure out ways to sort of fill in on that missing point.
On that, we just want to really thank you. This has been just absolutely fantastic. Thank you for coming out and spending time with us.
Thanks for coming.